Hey everybody, welcome to Seneca Lake Mysteries, the podcast where we explore the unusual, strange, and unexplained on New York's largest Finger Lake. If this is your first time listening, thank you. I'm glad you found your way to the podcast, and I'm happy you're here. And if you've been listening for a while, as always, thank you so much for supporting the show and being a part of this excursion into the offbeat, weird, and mystifying history around the Seneca Lake area. And if you enjoy the show, please share it, like it, comment, follow, rate, and review. It all goes a long way. And in case you missed it, the best way to stay up to date on the podcast and any other Seneca Lake Mysteries related news and updates is to get over to SenecaLakeMysteries.com and subscribe so you'll be the first to know everything that's going on. And again, keep those emails, messages, and voicemails coming. Let me know what's on your mind. If you have suggestions or questions or any feedback at all, let me know, and we'll keep this thing rolling. Seriously, I love to hear from you guys. One quick update. As I mentioned in the last episode, I recently took a trip up to the Alpine portal, also known as Connecticut Hill, a spot with a long and varied history of wild, paranormal, and unexplained reports, from Bigfoot to orbs to hauntings and high strangeness and a lot more. I was invited by a listener named Rick, who has hunted on Connecticut Hill for many years and is deeply familiar with the area. So Rick generously took a big chunk of time out of his Sunday morning and afternoon to show me a few places up on the hill, including something very unusual and intriguing that he had found. We ended up finding something quite unexpected and far wilder than I had anticipated. So last time I promised to tell the story in a future episode, and now I can tell you that it will be the next episode of the podcast on the 27th, and I'll tell you guys all about the crazy day we had up there at the Alpine portal. However, for this episode, as a bit of a preview, I'll be sharing a very strange experience that a listener shared with me that they had up on Connecticut Hill a few years ago. But first, in light of the recent viral appearance of a large cat, most likely a cougar, who was spotted wandering through a residential neighborhood in Rochester, New York, which is about 40 miles northwest of Seneca Lake. It happened earlier this month. I'm going to get into some stories about similar reports, which are known in the paranormal and cryptozoology communities as alien big cat sightings, that have happened on the west side of Seneca Lake, specifically reports of a large black cat similar to a panther that was spotted in a field and in the woods. Then next up is a story that has been written about in various books and websites, probably the most widely known UFO sighting in the history of the area, which was the 1952 sighting by multiple witnesses of aerial round silver spheres that floated over a Watkins Glen neighborhood, with one object seen just a few minutes later plunging and disappearing into Seneca Lake a short distance away. But in all the places I've seen this story, there are some pretty important details missing, details that came to light a few weeks after the event that for me really add to the impact and the credibility of this famous sighting. So I'm excited to tell you guys this story along with this quote-unquote new information. And finally, as I mentioned, I'll share a report verbatim that was sent to me by a listener of something that happened to them when they visited Connecticut Hill Cemetery a few years back. Now, honestly, I personally think that all three of these stories are bangers, and I almost wanted to save one or two of them for a future episode, but then I figured you guys have been so supportive and so cool to me, so why not do all three stories now and think about future episodes when the time comes. So that's what I'm going to do. And one more thing, I want to remind everyone out there that I'm always looking for stories and guests for the podcast. So if you or someone you know has had an unusual experience, whether paranormal or spiritual or odd or mysterious, I'd love to hear from you. I'll protect your anonymity if you prefer. Just let me know. Also, if you are someone who investigates or studies anything considered fringe or arcane or strange around Seneca Lake, hit me up. I'd love to hear what you're up to and talk about it on the podcast if you're all right with that. Because ultimately, I want this podcast to be more than just a way for people to learn cool history and folklore about the area. I really want it to help connect us together and build a community of people who are open-minded and curious about this beautiful and mysterious spot in the middle of New York State. Now, of course, I love the wineries and the waterfalls and the breweries and the restaurants and the state parks and the boats and the recreation and the farms, but I also think it's time more people knew that there's a lot more to this area, a lot more this area has to offer for those who believe that there's more than meets the eye in our world, and that there's something enigmatic and mystical in the landscape in and around Seneca Lake. So again, I appreciate you all. Let's get to it. So on the evening of July 9th, 2025, a resident of Rochester, New York, about 35 miles northwest of Seneca Lake, captured something completely unexpected on their Ring doorbell camera. The video caught what appears to be a very large cat, possibly a mountain lion or a cougar, walking down the street in a residential neighborhood. The local police received reports from numerous witnesses, and the video clip and story went viral, and big cat mania has been all the rage in Rochester since then. After a day or two, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation issued a statement saying that if the video is unaltered, then it appears to show a cougar. Now, because there is no wild population of cougars in New York State, or there hasn't been since the late 1800s, it's believed that the cat sighted in Rochester was a wild pet that had escaped. They checked with the local zoos, and all the local zoos reported that no big cats were missing. So, in light of this story, I was wondering, is there any history of out-of-place big cats being seen near Seneca Lake? And it turns out the answer is yes, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, I want to give a brief summary of what's known in the cryptozoological and paranormal circles as the alien big cat phenomenon. So the alien big cat phenomenon, or ABC, refers to sightings of large cats in unusual locations or circumstances, often accompanied by reports of strange behavior or unexplained events. Now, these sightings have occurred all over the world for well over a century, and while the locations around the world are varied, the United Kingdom is considered a hotspot for these ABC sightings, especially locations such as Bodmin Moor, Dartmoor, and Surrey. And in the U.S., multiple sightings have been reported in several states, including Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, and North Carolina. Now, these cats are frequently described as appearing out of place, with some witnesses suggesting that these cats seem to glitch or phase in and out of existence. Some reports include descriptions of the cats having unnaturally large eyes or exhibiting unusual agility or disappearing suddenly. Some of the more unusual theories explaining these cats range from the cats being interdimensional beings to the result of government experiments. Now, the reports frequently originate from rural areas, forests, and near bodies of water, suggesting some kind of connection to wild or remote environments. Specific locations mentioned in various reports include areas near military bases, locations with historical paranormal activity, and regions with high rates of UFO sightings. Now, with that in mind, I want to move on to the article from the Canandaigua Daily Messenger. It was published on April 7th, 2021, written by Len Lisenby, the outdoor columnist for the Daily Messenger. The title of the article is Cougars in the Finger Lakes? Of course they're here, at least kind of. So the article goes over the more recent history of big cat sightings in and around the Finger Lakes area. And one of them specifically is from the town of Benton, which the town of Benton, the southern border of the town of Benton is just north of Penn Yan, and it extends northeast to Benton Center and Bologna, and then it hits the western shore of Seneca Lake about 3 or 4 miles north of Dresden. So here's the sighting that is described in this article. Quote, 3 young Mennonite women, all daughters of Earl Martin, were visiting in the kitchen of one of their homes in the town of Benton. The lady that lived there happened to look out the window, and she saw a large black animal walking on the edge of a hay field less than 100 yards away. She had a clear view of the animal. She also had a pair of 10 by 50 binoculars. She and her sisters spent nearly 15 minutes watching the large critter mouse in the field. According to all 3 of those women, they watched a large cat. Its body was about 4 feet long, and its long, slender tail was about 3 feet long. It had a cat's face and ears, and it was jet black. They all felt it was about the size of a Labrador retriever. Earl went over to the house 2 days later, hoping to find some tracks. Despite what his daughters had described, he was still skeptical. Well, he found tracks. Lots of them, if the truth be known. He followed them for quite a distance, observing them in snowdrifts and muddy places. And Earl knows his animal tracks very well. Photos of the tracks were taken, by the way. He described those tracks to me. He said they were about 3 fingers wide, roughly 3 inches, and a little longer, possibly 3.5 to 4 inches long. And they were definitely cat tracks. Over the past few years, I have received more than a dozen other unconfirmed sightings of cougars, both black and tawny colored. The black cat sightings seem to range from around Penn Yan and Dundee, north to Benton Center, and from Seneca Lake west to Rushville. End quote. Now, keep in mind this article is not just about the Seneca Lake area. It also extends over to the South Hill, East Hill area of Canandaigua Lake. So a little further in the article, the author says, quote, the sightings of large tawny cats come from all over, but seem to be most common around the South Hill, East Hill area, and many, if not most of them, are really hard to refute. Like the 2 spring turkey hunters who were walking to their hunting area when they heard a loud animal-like scream. A few seconds later, a large black cat ran directly in front of them and jumped 8 feet up in a tree. Then it sat there as they observed it from a few yards away. I'd bet they had their turkey guns loaded and ready. They finally walked away with it still in that tree. Now that's hard to refute. End quote. Now, it's unclear from the article if the sightings from the 3 women in Benton were at around the same time as the sightings by these 2 turkey hunters. But regardless, it's certainly intriguing, and it certainly implies that there may have been or could still be a large black cat running around in the area west of Seneca Lake and east of Canandaigua Lake. Now, further in the article, the author, Mr. Lisenby, who was a former, I believe, Department of Fish and Wildlife law enforcement officer, retired, gives his professional opinion on what exactly would explain the sightings of this large black cat. Quote, I believe it is someone's pet leopard. It may have grown too large to safely handle. Then it either escaped or they foolishly let it go rather than suffer the personal pain of having to put it to sleep. That would also explain why it was not afraid of the two turkey hunters. And the reason I believe it is a leopard and not a black cougar is the footprints that were carefully observed and measured in the mud and snow. A cougar has very broad footpads that enable it to move over any type of surface, including deep snow. African leopards never encounter snow, and their feet are noticeably smaller. And there's one other thing. While cougars are fairly good tree climbers, leopards literally live in them. That would explain why the black, quote, cougar, end quote, jumped 8 feet up in a tree and sat there while the two hunters watched. There is a very good chance that this cat has undergone the same inhumane treatment most large pet cats are put through. Its sharp canine teeth were probably removed, as were its claws. That would explain why it had to jump into the tree and not climb it, or climb higher in it. Such a condition would also explain why a large cat was observed mousing in a field. Small animals are all it can hunt because it cannot easily kill a deer without canine teeth and claws, end quote. Now, I absolutely can see how the author's theory on this large black cat, the species being a leopard, the reasons for its behavior, all makes sense. It's not out of the question that someone in the area was illegally keeping an African black leopard as a pet, and that the animal somehow escaped. And the observations of the cat's behavior seem to point toward Mr. Lisenby's theory being plausible or even likely. But still, I have to wonder, were there more reports of this black leopard in the area, considering it was spotted in the town of Benton, which is mostly flat farmland with only pockets of forested areas? It would seem at least possible that someone else would have seen it, especially in the winter when a big black leopard would stand out against all the white snow. Also, Benton is at least 10 to 12 miles from the wooded area where the turkey hunters got screamed at by a large black cat that then jumped up into a tree and sat there watching them. And where did it go? Did it eventually starve and die deep in the woods? Or was it something else? Was it an alien big cat, some sort of glitch in the matrix, a creature that pops in and out of our reality in the fields and meadows around Seneca Lake, where unusual paranormal events and UFO sightings are just part of the landscape? I don't know. Let me know what you all think. In any case, it's just one more piece in the esoteric jigsaw puzzle around the mysteries of Seneca Lake. So this is the story of the Watkins Glen Silver Sphere Splashdown from 1952. Now, it's helpful to provide some context into the events that were happening around the United States at the time of the sighting in Watkins Glen. So that's where I'm going to start. Now, just under a month before the sighting in Watkins Glen, on July 29th, 1952, the United States Air Force Director of Intelligence, along with the United States Air Force Director of Operations, conducted the largest press conference at the Pentagon since World War II. In the historic statement, the Air Force publicly acknowledged for the first time their keen interest in flying saucers or UFOs, and they revealed that they'd investigated between 1,000 and 2,000 UFO reports since 1947. Now, they stated that their investigations found explanations for the vast majority of the reports. However, they admitted there were a handful of reports for which no explanation could be found. But they went on to assure the public that none of the unexplained reports posed any threat to national security. Now, the reason for the Air Force's sudden transparency was in response to a massive increase in UFO sightings during the previous 2 or 3 months across the country, most notably in Washington, D.C., where multiple sightings over the final 2 weekends of July had generated international news headlines. The illuminated objects over the nation's capital were simultaneously detected on radar and observed visually by both military and civilian pilots, which resulted in the scrambling of fighter jets and undoubtedly a lot of freaking out inside the White House and the Pentagon. Now, during that same time frame, numerous sightings were reported to the east of the Finger Lakes in central New York and to the southwest of the Finger Lakes in the southern tier. But it wasn't long before the so-called flying saucers began showing up near Seneca Lake. So on July 28th, which was the day before the Pentagon press conference, and the morning after the final saucer sightings over the nation's capital, an elliptical object was observed hovering over Geneva, New York, at the northern tip of Seneca Lake. Witnesses watched as vapor trails, ostensibly from fighter jets, closed in on the objects, but before the fighter jets could reach it, the object flew upward, disappearing into the clouds. Now, the sighting was significant enough to draw the notice of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, N-I-C-A-P, who included it in their 1964 book, The UFO Evidence, which was a detailed examination of hundreds of UFO reports the organization had compiled through 1963. And that book, The UFO Evidence, is considered one of the most important books written on the subject of UFOs in the 20th century. Then on Friday, August 1st, at around 9:45 a.m., just 3 days after the Geneva sighting, Byron Kronk of Dundee, which is a village about 10 miles north of Watkins Glen and a few miles west of Seneca Lake, was looking at what he first believed to be a bright star in the northeast sky in the direction of the lake. Then suddenly the light shot straight upwards, then briefly paused before traveling abruptly to the north, while it was emitting what appeared to be a smoke or a vapor behind it until it was out of sight. The object made no sound, and then within seconds, Byron Kronk saw what looked like the same strange light moving southward until he lost sight of it in the morning sun. And meanwhile, that same day, newspaper offices in Elmira were inundated. Elmira, which is about 20 miles south of Watkins Glen, the newspaper offices there were inundated with hundreds of calls from people reporting shiny and round, as well as pancake or disc-shaped flying objects. Also, that same day in Afton, just east of the Finger Lakes, locals had gathered in the streets and watched round objects passing across the sky in large numbers for around 2 hours. And there were additional sightings reported in south central New York State, as well as the eastern and western regions, making it one of the largest single-day UFO flaps, if not the largest, in New York State history. Then, just a few weeks later, multiple witnesses in 2 locations not only saw something strange above Watkins Glen, but also above and in Seneca Lake. And the story was so incredible, it ended up being reported by newspapers across the state. It's been cited in UFO books over the years, and at the time it even drew the attention of the United States Air Force. So the story begins at around 9:30 a.m. on Monday, August 25th, 1952, when Watkins Glen resident Marion Granston looked up to see 2 objects gliding silently just above the top of the big elm tree in her yard on Glen Avenue. They were large silver balls about 4 feet across with narrow platforms around their circumferences. Now, Mrs. Granston wasn't the only person observing these objects, though. There were 3 neighborhood boys, ages 5, 8, and 9, who were also watching these strange aerial spheres. Now, the boys got excited. They ran home to tell their mother, but by the time they returned, the objects were gone. Now, 5 minutes later, 3 carpenters from Schuyler County were working on the roof of a house at Glen Eldridge Point on the eastern shore of Seneca Lake, about 2.5 miles northeast of Marion Granston's home. The 3 men watched as a single, shiny, metallic silver ball about 4 feet across floated through the air above the lake. When it was about 150 feet from shore, the object, which the men described as shining like a big sheet of silver, abruptly plummeted down into about 40 feet of water, generating an 8-foot splash before it vanished under the surface. So the New York State Troopers in Horseheads, New York, about 18 miles south of Watkins Glen, were contacted to investigate these reports. Now, Marion Granston also contacted civil defense authorities. And meanwhile, in the town of Trumansburg, about 15 miles about 15 miles northeast of Watkins Glen, multiple witnesses saw 5 jets chasing a flying saucer. So before long, news reporters contacted the United States Air Force at Hancock Field in Syracuse, who confirmed that fighter jets from the 32nd Air Division were on maneuvers in the Watkins Glen area, but they had no information about anybody pursuing any flying saucers. Still, the Air Force told reporters that they would, quote, investigate the Seneca Lake incident, end quote. So that evening, the troopers told reporters that they were considering doing a grappling operation on Seneca Lake the next day to locate and see if they could recover the silver sphere down that off of Glen Eldridge. However, the next morning, a trooper spokesman stated that they would not move forward with the recovery effort, and he gave the following explanation. Quote, "We'll have to look into the matter, but we can't say just how far this thing will go. If this thing did land in the lake, it would be pretty hard to find, as there are parts of the lake in which we have no idea how deep the water is. It would be foolish to begin grappling operations until such time as we can pinpoint the locale better." End quote. Now, the troopers were well advised to exercise some caution because although the object landed in about 40 feet of water, the lake's depth drops to over 400 feet, just a short distance from that point of entry. Still, there were 3 witnesses, no more than a few hundred feet away from the object when it dove into the lake, and it would seem those witnesses could pinpoint the locale with enough accuracy to justify a grappling operation in the immediate area. But ultimately, the state police would not do any grappling for a flying saucer. So how did the troopers attempt to explain the pair of 4-foot wide silver spheres that Marion Granston and the 3 boys saw floating over Watkins Glen, and the single 4-foot wide silver sphere that a trio of Schuyler County carpenters saw flying over and diving into Seneca Lake? Well, Sergeant J. Edward Maloney of the Horseheads State Police offered one possible explanation, saying that one of the Air Force fighter jets flying in the area may have jettisoned an empty fuel tank, an occurrence that he said happened frequently. Now, while this might seem like a plausible scenario, it would also mean that an American military plane on maneuvers over a populated Watkins Glen area dropped an empty gas tank a couple hundred feet from a private home. So at minimum, this would have been some cause for alarm and a request for answers from the Air Force at Hancock Field. And that's not to mention that a jettisoned fuel tank would fall to the ground. It wouldn't travel across the sky as all the witnesses described. But regardless, the troopers evidently closed the book on their one-day investigation. Then on August 27th, 1952, 2 days after the Watkins Glen sightings and the splashdown, one local news report stated that local residents had come up with another theory to explain away the sightings, in which they hypothesized that some local children lost control of a kite, which flew into the lake. Then the article went on to note that life on Eldridge Point had returned to normal, with kids swimming and adults fishing for panfish instead of mysterious flying saucers. And that would be the last news update for a little while from the state police or the United States Air Force. And no more newspaper stories about saucers flying over Watkins Glen and diving into Seneca Lake. Everyone seemed to have moved on from the Watkins Glen UFO story, except Marion Granston. And an article in the Watkins Glen Review on September 17th, 1952, 23 days after the Silver Sphere sightings, provided more background into Marion Granston and what she did after the local authorities refused to, or failed to, meaningfully investigate the event. So it turns out that back in World War II, Marion had been a trained observer in Pleasantville, New Jersey. Now, although the specific type of work Mrs. Granston performed is unclear from the article, there are two likely possibilities. One, she may have been trained as a weather observer, monitoring weather conditions for various military flights and training activities in the area of Pleasantville, New Jersey, which included the Naval Air Station Atlantic City and the Atlantic City Training Center for the U.S. Army Air Forces. Now, two, Marion may have been trained as an aircraft observer, monitoring and reporting on both U.S. military and other aircraft along the New Jersey coast, because in 1942, German submarines had attacked and sunk at least 24 ships off the coast of New Jersey. So that area was under constant surveillance. But regardless of the exact nature of her job, Marion Granston would likely have developed above average observational skills due to her receiving training during wartime at a major U.S. military hub on the east coast of the U.S. So when two strange metal balls floated over her yard in the summer of 1952, Marion was able to provide a more reliable and accurate firsthand account than the majority of people in Watkins Glen. And being trained to observe and report, she observed the silver spheres and then reported her observations to local and state authorities. But Mrs. Granston didn't stop there. It seems that she believed that her experience was important enough to relay it directly and in great detail to the highest authority in the country. So Marion Granston wrote a letter to the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, describing her sighting of the floating metallic spheres. And just over 2 weeks later, she received a reply in the form of a letter, not from President Truman, but instead from the Director of Legislation and Liaison of the Department of the Air Force, a General Robert E. L. Eaton. Now, General Eaton's letter stated that Marion's report was under evaluation and had been made a matter of record by the Air Force. The general also sent Mrs. Granston a lengthy report that mirrored the statements made in the historic press conference in Washington, D.C. just a few weeks prior. And here's what the general relayed to Mrs. Granston. Quote, "To date, the Air Force has undertaken to investigate and analyze about 1,500 reports dealing with these phenomena. Most of the reports were identified and disposed of as friendly aircraft erroneously reported, known electronics and meteorological phenomena, light aberrations, hoaxes, and other known natural occurrences or man-made objects. The unexplained reports, which are in the order of 20% of the total, cannot be definitely associated with these familiar things. The Air Force has stated in the past and reaffirms at the present time that these unidentified aerial phenomena are not a secret weapon, missile, or aircraft developed by the United States. None of the 3 military departments nor any other agency in the government is conducting experiments, classified or otherwise, with flying objects which could be a basis for the reported phenomena. As far as is known, there is nothing in them that is associated with material or vehicles that are directed against the United States from another country or from another planet." End quote. So while the 1952 Silver Sphere sightings and Splashdown are remembered as an interesting and bizarre moment, little piece of folklore from 20th century history of Watkins Glen and Seneca Lake, this additional information to me provides some critical missing context from the story that's been repeated and republished for the last 70 years. It certainly seems to me that Marion Granston did not observe a military jet fuel tank falling from the sky and misidentify it as 2 4-foot wide shining silver balls with a small platform around their circumferences. Mrs. Granston was trained by the U.S. military to observe things in the sky. So if she says she saw mysterious silver spheres in the air, I believe her. And she obviously felt strong enough that her sighting to write a letter to the President of the United States. So to me, I think the 1952 sightings were not only credible, but considering the numerous reports in the coming years of flying objects entering the lake, they were also deeply important to our understanding of the subject of UFOs in the Seneca Lake area. So back in early June, I received a message from someone who lives in the Seneca Lake area, and they said they had a strange story to tell me about their experience visiting Connecticut Hill. So I replied to them and said, sure, I'd love to hear the story. If you want, you can tell me the story here, or you can send me an email. So they ended up sending me an email, which I received, in early June. And it's really quite a remarkable, intriguing, weird story. And I'm going to tell you the story here. Now, keep in mind, the author of this, the person who went through this experience, was very, very adamant that they did not want their identity used or exposed in any way on the podcast. So I assured them of that. And that also, I believe that also had something to do with their sort of reticence to go into too many more further details on their experience, which I understand completely. This is a pretty crazy story, and I understand that not everyone wants to put themselves out there like that. So without further ado, let me read you the initial email that I got from this person. Quote, "All right, this is the first time I've written this story down. This takes place in the late winter or early spring of 2020, right in the beginning of COVID when things started to shut down the first time. It was the week when our local officials actually requested a lockdown. Midway through the week, my wife and I, feeling a bit of cabin fever, decided to go for a drive or a hike. We live not far from the Connecticut Hill area, but have never been up there. One of us had recently heard a story of a witch buried in a cemetery up on the hill, and we thought we should go check out the area and maybe stumble on an old cemetery. When we left the house, I think it was around 11, maybe close to noon, but it was late morning. This is important for later. We drove up towards Alpine and navigated the few roads to get to Connecticut Hill Forest, only about a 10 to 15 minute drive from our home. Once you reach this area, it's all seasonal use dirt roads. I remember there was a small dusting of snow on the ground. Within a few short minutes, we were looking at a cemetery. We didn't have to search at all. We got out and walked up the path into the cemetery. The first thing I noticed was that there were already footprints in the snow up there. Didn't think much of it since I'm sure it's a popular spot to hike around. I walked some more into the graveyard and right up to a headstone that immediately gave me goosebumps. It was a headstone on the ground, broken to pieces, and had all kinds of offerings and little dolls and things like that on it. Very creepy. This was the grave of Elizabeth. If you Google this, you will see photos of exactly what I saw. I looked at it for only a few seconds, trying to imagine who would do this and why. This feeling overcame me that seemed like the more I questioned why this happened, the more I felt like I should leave. So I turned around and met my wife, who was already back at the car. She said she felt the same way. We drove down the road the way we came and were quickly realizing things didn't look the same. The road to get to the cemetery was one road with maybe one turn in it. Not hard to backtrack. Sure enough, we were lost. Driving in one direction way too long, coming to a dead end or a bridge that was out, and turning back. This was very strange. But the moment when things really got strange is when the sun started to go down. From the time we left the cemetery, we were driving around lost for maybe 20 minutes. It should have only been around 1 or 1:30 in the afternoon, but it was getting dark. My gas light came on, and we had no cell service. This was really weird. We drove around a little more and finally popped out into a spot we recognized and got home as the sun was setting. Now, I know I took photos on my phone, and I wanted to reference those for the timestamp. The photos were gone. Nothing on my phone or hers from that time. I'll end my story here, as I'm not going to speculate on what I think happened. It was very strange, and I still feel like I don't want to go back there, even as curious as I am. If you have questions about the story, please let me know, but this is the basics of it. So after I read this, I immediately checked to see approximately the time of sunset in the month of March in this area, because this event would have happened in mid to late March in 2020. And at that time of year, sunset is it's after 7 o'clock, somewhere between 7 and 7:30. So right off the bat, we're looking at a loss of hours of time, 4-5 hours of time that this individual lost while driving around on Connecticut Hill when it only felt like 20 minutes. Also, the issue with none of the photographs coming up in the phones after they left, the gas light coming on, the loss of cell service. These are all kind of things that have been reported around Connecticut Hill before. Vehicles, batteries, electronic failures, time distortions, getting lost and disoriented, and odd experiences around the cemetery. So I had a lot more questions. So I asked this individual several more questions, and they gave me a response. It didn't seem like they wanted to go into any more details, so which they mentioned in a future email. But I'll also give you the last few details. that this person gave me when I asked more questions. Quote, "To start, I want to emphasize that the big takeaway I have from this is how quick and effortless it was to find not only the cemetery, but the grave. It was like we were being led to it. However, the return was not that at all. In the moment, nothing seemed really too strange. Our mood during it was, well, this is weird, not nervous or uncomfortable feeling like you may expect. I would say amused. When we returned home, we went about everything as normal. I only think of this story every once in a while." End quote. So, to be honest, when I started reading the story, up until the part where this person and their wife got lost, I was kind of thinking that it could have just been a case of someone getting weirded out when they went to an unfamiliar area deep in the woods that has a lot of folklore about ghosts and a haunted cemetery. I figured it was possible that they simply stumbled upon the cemetery, saw the creepy old, overgrown, forgotten graves, including the well-known grave of Elizabeth and her shattered tombstone and all the little trinkets, and their imaginations got carried away. Then, being somewhat shaken and spooked, they got in their car, took a wrong turn, and got lost, which is entirely possible up on that hill. They had no cell service, which is common on Connecticut Hill, and maybe they coincidentally were low on gas, causing their gas gauge alarm to go off. All of that I thought could be explained, but the lost time part, I can't think of a reasonable explanation, because we're not talking about a half hour or just a simple case of losing track of time. It was possibly 5 or 6 hours. Also very weird is the fact that neither of the two people in the car were even remotely freaked out by all that lost time. If it was me and I realized that 4 or 5, 6 hours had gone by, I would be wondering what happened. But they got home and went about their lives like the only thing that happened was a visit to a creepy cemetery that led to them temporarily getting lost on the way home. And with the lost time, I also had to reconsider the way they found the cemetery, which isn't terribly easy to find if you're just driving up that hill with no direction and not knowing exactly where you're going. So I really want to thank this person for telling me this story. In my other messages to them, I could tell that they still felt very uneasy about what happened on that day. And in my opinion, I think that these two people are just part of a long history of people having experiences of high strangeness at the Alpine portal, which is another name and actually my preferred name for the Connecticut Hill area. So what do you guys think? Have you had anything strange happen up on the Alpine portal? What could explain such a loss of time? Let me know. And also keep listening, because I'm going to be looking into the Alpine portal a lot more in future episodes of the podcast. And if you haven't been there and you live close enough, it might be a good time for you to take a trip up on Connecticut Hill and see what the Alpine portal has in store for you. Well, that's it for this time around. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. And if you have any thoughts on any of the topics in this episode, please let me know. And remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and get over to SenecaLakeMysteries.com and subscribe to the email list so you don't miss anything. A new podcast comes out every month on the 7s. I'll talk to you then.